It's a much smaller scale, but in 1980, my dad and I, we bought an old farm that had been a pig and sheep farm. I want to tell a story about that in a moment and how I make a comparison with what would happen if we had to sell some of the lands, federal lands in places like Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, Nevada, and how we could then afford to manage those. Because there's a trade-off in there, obviously. But let me get to that in just a moment. It's 9:44. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 23. High Desert Meat Processing processes one animal at a time. What you bring in is what you're going to get back. Darren Van Horn, the owner of High Desert Meat Processing in Twin Falls, he's got more than 30 years' experience doing this. You can visit High Desert Meat Processing on Facebook. We've had some great reviews, not only on air, but if you would like to see more, Facebook is the place to go. You can give High Desert Meat Processing a call for all of your wild game and your domestic processing needs, 734-9949. High Desert Meat does in-house smoking. Nothing gets shipped out. Specialty meats such as jerky, pepperoni, salami, summer sausage, kielbasa, breakfast sausage, brats, Polish dogs, hot dogs, and much more. USDA approved. And Darren works closely with local beef growers on their programs to ensure quality meat. 734-9949. So 1980, summer of 1980, my dad and I was just getting out of high school. We decided to buy ourselves an old farm, which sat on a hillside across the street from a road, from a lake on the other side of the road. And we bought it from a family that had owned it for a few generations. It had been started actually by a medical doctor who was looking for a little extra investment on the side. And so we loved the looks of the property. We ended up buying it. Eventually built a house there, kept for a while the grazing area and a barn and all of that. But we built a house in record time and got that set up. Interestingly enough, there was a fellow who lived across the road, and he owned two houses on the lake, and his name was Del Carn. In fact, the Carn family had owned these homes on the lake for many, many years, but they had bought them from Dr. Hackett. And Dr. Hackett had stipulated that they could not close the docks that were attached to the people who lived on the other side on the farm. In other words, Dr. Hackett and his family. So when we bought the property, whenever I felt like going swimming or fishing, I went down and I sat on Dell's dock, and I would go fishing. And Dell would come out, shoot the breeze. We were good friends. I mean, it wasn't like this was an antagonistic situation. We didn't do it on the air yesterday, but as Kelton Hatch was leaving the building, I was having an off-air conversation with him about all of the land. It's not just this family from Texas, the Wilkes brothers. They're buying 38,000 acres in Idaho. They have an excess of 300,000 acres in Montana. There are worries that what's happening in Idaho will happen similar to what happened in Montana, and that is a lot of roads got closed off to some federal lands in the area because the roads went through the land that they bought. And he pointed out yesterday, that is, Kelton pointed out before he left the studios, that we've had a lot of those sales as well, even in southern and in eastern Idaho, similar types of sales, different families. And I said, is it possible, and I told the story of the dock rights, is it possible that before these lands are sold off, that you could stipulate that those roads have to stay open so the public could enjoy it? And our caller made a great point. If 1.1 to 1.4 million people would have to take care of firefighting costs on these lands, and we're going to have fires every summer, that's obvious. I mean, that's part of the world we live in. There are lightning strikes, other issues that come up that cause fires. It would bankrupt us very, very quickly. And right now, as he pointed out, you've got 50 states, taxpayers in 50 states who help you with those firefighting costs. So yes, you would have to sell off some of those lands to private people, as he pointed out, from Silicon Valley. Or you already have a lot of the Hollywood wealth that's up in Sun Valley and in Bellevue and Ketchum and those areas. You'd see more of that coming into Idaho. There might be some development. There might be some more logging. Those things would go on. You realize that there's now more forest land in the eastern United States than there is in the western United States. Development that seems a surprise to a lot of people because in 1900 it was completely the opposite. And yet they're not overrun with federal lands in that part of the country. So they must have found a workable solution, is all I'm saying. And I think that there is room. The fact that 75% of Nevada is in federal hands, these are sovereign states. They're not colonies. They're not territories. They're sovereign states. And we could at least try and generate a bit more for the economy, which would also help pay for some of those firefighting costs if a percentage of that land was sold off into private hands. But you would have to stipulate that the roads stay open. If I would like to get into the back country, that the road that has taken me there for decades, that has to stay open, and you have to make it clear to these people. Maybe even you stipulate they have to help pay for the road maintenance down the road. Bit redundant there. But if you do that, I think it could work out. Now, they may feel that they don't want to pay for the road maintenance and to allow people through there. Then you sell it to the guy who will. 950, call it 950, coming up on 950, 736-0300, 736-0300. You're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you on Top Story, and you're up next. You're on the air.
Good morning, Bill. Bill, the cleanest burning coal in the world is in Indonesia, owned by the Riyadi family, who gave money to Bill Clinton. The other cleanest burning coal is in Utah. Bill Clinton made the mine in Utah a national park, and I hope you can get the senators from Utah and the reps from Utah to talk about how it adversely affected the communities around that field.
It might be worthwhile to do that. I think I can get some phone numbers and gather those. Thank you much for the call. The environmental worries. My sister still lives in western New York State, and she's about 15 miles from the Pennsylvania border. Just across the border, there are 70,000 jobs that were tied to fracking for natural gas. And in my hometown, on the New York side of the state line, it's like 1933. At some point, government has to say people are just as equal as a snail darter or a sage grouse. You're up next. You're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. One thing I was going to bring up about sort of changing it into private hands is the moment that happens, it all gets posted, so the heritage that Idaho has of hunting and fishing gets pushed away, or you have to lease the rights. Also, I've noticed that ranchers seem to, they talk about being good stewards of the land, but they've literally raped our sagebrush.
I drive up and down the interstate. I see a lot of sagebrush. I don't know where it all got raped, to be honest with you.
I've lived here my whole life, and we used to have all kinds of sagebrush and thick sagebrush, and it's gone. It's filled with cheatgrass that ranchers brought in.
What's the value of sagebrush?
The value of sagebrush is that it is a natural vegetation. It stops. It doesn't burn like the invasive species. It supports the wildlife.
Well, what was here in this valley, let's say, before 1880?
Okay.
I mean, did anyone actually live in this valley? Could you live in this valley before 1880?
Obviously, you could have, because people did it. They moved in and did live here. I'm not saying that none of us should.
They came in and they lived here because they irrigated it and they started growing other plants.
That's exactly correct. However, what I'm saying is that if we take the land we have now and turn it over to the private use, it will be posted.
But there you go again. You can write into any sale and any deed that certain roads and certain lands are going to remain in perpetuity open to the public, and you will still have that. It's just the vastness.
If they were to do it that way, that would be perfectly acceptable, because I dislike the federal government as much as the next guy. I mean, they do stick their nose in way too much crap.
I will agree with that. At least we find some common agreement.
Yeah, and I am pretty conservative, but I've also seen that the lands that I hunted and fished when I was young has been degraded, and it's also, people buy it and it's posted now. And that's my concerns.
People are buying land and constantly all over the country, and I would, as I just mentioned, my own hometown, they would love something called development. When I drive down Blue Lakes Boulevard and I see what's going on here, they crave that. They can't get it. We have a caller with us. You're up next. You're on the air.
Good morning, Bill. This is Pat.
Sure, Pat.
My grandfather, when I was a boy, we bought a ranch. It's probably about 100,000 acres or a little more. And it was solid sagebrush. And as he said, you couldn't run 40 head of heifers on 100,000 acres and feed them, because there was no grass in the sagebrush. It was just sagebrush. it takes over and it becomes a predominant factor. It just becomes a wall of sagebrush. And as a child growing up, we removed all the sagebrush and planted it to crescent wheatgrass, which does not burn, and produce it into a magnificent ranch that feeds cattle greatly. And so those that think the sagebrush is so great, it's not that great.
And you still probably have sage grouse that can survive even with the new plants, right?
I'll tell you what, sage grouse don't eat just sagebrush. They eat a lot of the forage that grows around the sagebrush. And to have sage grouse, you have to have a source of water. In some of these areas, there was no water within 10 miles of anywhere. So the ranchers put in watering systems and supplied water all around the valley, and it also feeds the livestock with water, or the wildlife with water. So when they say the sagebrush is so great, it was not so great. This valley was solid sagebrush when the pioneers came through, and they never saw such a desolate place in their whole life. So sagebrush is great where it is, but we don't need it.
Hey, thank you. Human ingenuity what I call it, terraformed the valley and made it livable for human beings and probably a lot of other animals. 9:55, you're up next. You're on the air on Top Story. All right, we'll try line number 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it is. You're up next. You're on the air.
Good morning. You want to remember one thing, the Forest Service and BLM have closed more roads and trails than any private landowners in the West.
Yeah.
Just a point. Thank you.
Thank you. And they've done a lot of that in just recent years. What's happened is the philosophy of the BLM and some of the other federal agencies has changed from conservation to just simply walling everything off. And we're now viewed as being some sort of invasive species that has to be, we have to rid the world of. I'm not so sure, being that I'm a member of that species, that I like that thought. 9:55. If you're listening to this program this morning, God bless you. If you're having difficulty listening to this program, and maybe it's because of the opinions and thoughts of the host, might though be otherwise because you're having some difficulty with your hearing. And I'd like to recommend you give a telephone call to Dr. Christine Pickup. She's a doctor of audiology at Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert, 1218 9th Street, unit number 2. You can call her office and set up an appointment for a screening, 208-312-0957, or go online, MountHarrisonAudiology.com. And she asks if you're on medicine for high blood pressure or a diuretic. They can affect your hearing. It's a reflection of your overall health. When you come in for a free wellness hearing, Dr. Pickup will review your medications and also discuss ways to protect your hearing in the future. You're up next. You're on the air on Top Story with Bill Colley on KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. My phone's cutting in and out, so if I drop you, I apologize in advance. But, you asked if anybody lived here in the 1880s, and there was actually ranchers who lived here in the 1880s. And they were the predominant group of people clear up until the early 1905, 1910. I read a lot of the early books.
But before
and one of the reasons they were here and the reason they did so well is because there was no sagebrush, as a matter of fact.
Really?
I can refer to 3 or 4 books that you can actually read that's the reason they ranched here so well. The UC cattle companies came down in from the south down to this area, and the sagebrush was due to a lot of drought in the early 1905 through 1920s, and that's by all accounts that I can read when the sagebrush really took off. So it hasn't been here forever, and the sagebrush were here long before the sagebrush was. So.
And thank you for the call. I read a book that was published in 1976. The books were commissioned all over the country for the bicentennial of the country at the time, the 200th anniversary. And there was a newspaper reporter who was commissioned to write one about Idaho, and it was the first thing I read when I got here. And he was explaining that prior to 1880, you'd had several attempts especially by the Mormon Church to colonize southern Idaho, and these were often failures because it was so dry. And one of our other callers a few minutes ago pointed out that the first explorers coming through here thought, oh, you can't live here. But by 1880, it is true, they had started actually ranching, and that's when people started realizing, too, hey, we'll just cut some ditches here. We'll bring the water to us instead of waiting to see if it'll ever happen. And voila, it changed. And you know what? This valley is expected to support, Don Hall told me this a few months ago, another 1 million people over the next 20 to 30 years. Why? because of irrigation. And yes, you're going to see a lot more development, and a lot of happy hunting grounds are going to be gone. But you know what? There's going to be a huge tax base, better roads, better hospitals, all of those things with progress. God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'm back here between 8 and 10 o'clock tomorrow. Have a good day.